January the 17th, 1945. Aachen, Germany. The snow fell in silent curtains over the shattered remains of what had once been Charlemagne City. In the cellar of a half-collapsed apartment building on Wilhelmstrasse, the air hung thick with the smell of damp stone, unwashed bodies, and something else, something sweet and rotten that clung to the back of the throat. 14 civilians huddled in the darkness, their breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. Among them, a woman named Margaret Schroeder clutched a bundle of cloth to her chest, rocking back and forth in a motion that had become automatic, mechanical, divorced from hope. Inside that bundle, her daughter, 4-year-old Anneliese, lay dying. The child's breathing came in shallow, rattling gasps. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that Margaret recognized from the others who had died in this cellar over the long winter months. The fever had raged for 3 days. The little girl's eyes, when they opened at all, stared at nothing. Outside, the rumble of distant artillery marked the American advance, a sound that had once filled these people with terror but now barely registered. They had passed beyond terror into a kind of numb acceptance. The Reich that had promised them greatness had delivered only this, a tomb beneath the ruins, where children died in their mother's arms while the world burned overhead. An elderly man, Herr Volkmann, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, reached out and touched Margaret's shoulder with a trembling hand. "You must let her go," he whispered in the darkness. "You must save your strength." Margaret did not respond. She had stopped crying hours ago. There were no tears left. The other women in the cellar had already begun to look away, to withdraw into themselves. They had seen this before. They knew how it ended. In the cellar's corner, another woman, Frau Dietrich, clutched her own child closer, a boy of 7 whose 2 large eyes reflected the single candle's flame. She had learned not to hope. Hope was a luxury that belonged to the world above, the world before, the world that no longer existed. The child in Margaret's arms convulsed once, weakly, and then lay still. To understand what happened next, one must first understand what had brought these people to this moment. Not just the military campaigns or the grand strategies, but the slow, terrible unraveling of everything they had been taught to believe. For 12 years, the German people had been told a story. It was a story about destiny, about the superiority of will, about a new order that would last 1,000 years. The Nazis had promised them greatness, and for a time, it had seemed as though those promises might be kept. The early victories had been intoxicating. Poland in weeks, France in months, the entire continent seemingly bowing before the Wehrmacht's power. The newsreels had shown endless columns of prisoners, captured equipment, conquered cities. The radio had proclaimed each triumph with martial music and ecstatic announces. In every German home, the message had been the same. We are winning. We are invincible. We are the future. But by January of 1945, that future had collapsed into ash and rubble. 2. Aachen had been the first German city to fall to the Allies, surrendered in October of 1944 after weeks of brutal urban combat that left over 80% of its buildings damaged or destroyed. The Americans had fought for it street by street, house by house, room by room. When the shooting finally stopped, the city that had once been the seat of Charlemagne's empire, the symbolic heart of German Christianity and culture, had been reduced to broken walls and empty windows. The civilian population that remained, those who had not fled or been evacuated, found themselves trapped between the rubble of their past and an uncertain future. They had been taught to fear the Americans. The Nazi propaganda machine had worked tirelessly to paint a picture of the enemy as barbaric, savage, driven by Jewish influence to destroy Germanic civilization. The newsreels and posters had shown caricatures of American soldiers as gangsters and criminals, as racially impure mongrels commanded by Jewish overlords. German civilians had been told what would happen when the Americans came. Their men would be shot, their women raped, their children murdered. The Soviets, pushing from the east, were presented as even worse, Asiatic hordes bent on extermination. But the Americans, they were told, were almost as bad. The Americans would show no mercy. And so when the shelling finally stopped and the American troops entered Aachen, Many civilians chose to hide rather than surrender. They retreated into cellars and basements, into the buried spaces beneath the ruined city, and they waited. They waited to die, or to be discovered, or for some miracle that their starving minds could no longer quite imagine. In these dark holes, disease spread quickly. There was no clean water, no medicine, no heat. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was brutally cold. Children, the elderly, the weak, they began to die in the darkness, and there was nothing anyone could do but wrap the bodies and set them aside and try to survive another day. This was the world Margaret Schroeder inhabited on that January evening when her daughter stopped breathing. She did not scream. She had no strength for screaming. Instead, she simply held the small body closer and began to rock again. That same mechanical motion, as if the rhythm itself could somehow pull the child back from wherever she had gone. The others in the cellar looked away. Herr Volkmann bowed his head. Frau Dietrich clutched her son tighter and whispered a prayer, though she was no longer certain anyone was listening. Then, from above, came the sound of boots on rubble. Heavy boots. Multiple pairs. Moving with purpose through the ruins. Everyone in the cellar froze. For weeks they had hidden successfully, scavenging at night, retreating before dawn. But now someone was above them, and those footsteps were moving closer. Herr Volkmann blew out the candle. In the sudden darkness, they could hear their own breathing, quick and frightened, and the sound of those boots, and then voices speaking English. American voices. A beam of light cut through the darkness as a flashlight found the cellar entrance. The wooden boards they had piled over the opening scraped as they were pulled aside. The light swung down into the cellar, and behind it came a voice, speaking in heavily accented but comprehensible German. "Is anyone down there? Civilians? Come out. No one will hurt you." No one moved. The terror of months could not be dispelled by a single sentence. They had been told too many lies, lived through too many betrayals. In the darkness, someone whimpered, a child's voice, quickly stifled. The beam of light swept across the huddled forms, and then the voice came again, softer this time. "Please, we have food. We have doctors. Come out." Still, no one moved. And then Margaret, still holding her daughter's body, still rocking in that automatic rhythm, spoke into the darkness. Her voice was hoarse, cracked from disuse and grief. "My child is dead." There was a pause. Then the sound of more movement above, a brief exchange in English, and then two figures descended into the cellar. American soldiers, their uniforms dark in the flashlight's beam, white armbands with red crosses visible on their sleeves. Medics. They moved carefully, speaking softly in English and broken German, their flashlights revealing the extent of the horror in that underground space. The emaciated faces, the hollow eyes, the bundles of rags that might have been people or might have been corpses. One of the medics, a young man whose nameplate read Cohen, approached Margaret. He knelt beside her in the filth of the cellar floor, his clean uniform incongruous in that place of decay. He gestured toward the bundle she held. "May I?" he asked in German, his accent thick but his meaning clear. Margaret looked at him with eyes that had forgotten how to hope. But something in his face, some combination of youth and earnestness and an almost unbearable gentleness, made her hands loosen. She let him take the bundle. Cohen unwrapped the cloth carefully, revealing the small, gray face of the child. He pressed two fingers against her neck, feeling for a pulse. His partner, whose nameplate read Martinez, moved closer with the flashlight. For a long moment, both medics were silent, examining the child with swift, practiced movements. Then Cohen looked up at Margaret. "She's alive," he said. Margaret would later say that she did not believe him, could not believe him. She had felt the child go still in her arms. She had felt the life leave. And yet the American medic was already moving with sudden, urgent purpose. He laid the child flat on a cleared space of floor, tilting her head back, checking her airway. Martinez was opening his medical kit, pulling out equipment that gleamed impossibly clean in the flashlight's beam. They worked together with the synchronized efficiency of men who had performed these actions hundreds of times, in bunkers and foxholes and bombed-out buildings across France and Belgium and now Germany. Cohen placed his mouth over the child's nose and mouth and breathed. Once. Twice. Martinez had a stethoscope pressed to her chest, listening. Cohen breathed again. The other civilians in the cellar had stopped cowering. They were watching now, drawn out of their paralysis by something unprecedented, the sight of enemy soldiers fighting for the life of a German child. Pulse, Martinez said in English. Faint but there. Cohen nodded and reached for a syringe from the medical kit. He drew liquid from a small vial. Later, Margaret would learn it was adrenaline, and injected it carefully into the child's arm. Then they waited. Both medics bent over the small body, and in that moment of suspension, something shifted in the cellar. The watching Germans, who had spent months hiding from these men, who had been taught to fear them as instruments of destruction, saw instead something entirely different. Two young men, exhausted and dirty from weeks of combat, working with absolute focus to save a life that their commanders, their doctrine, their orders did not require them to save. The child gasped. It was a small sound, barely audible, but in the silence of that cellar it might as well have been a thunderclap. Annelise's chest rose with sudden breath. Her eyelids fluttered, and Margaret, who had not cried when she thought her daughter was dead, began to weep. Cohen wrapped the child in a clean blanket from his pack. Clean, imagine that, clean cloth in this place of filth, and handed her gently back to her mother. Martinez was already calling up to the soldiers above, speaking rapidly in English. Within minutes, more Americans had descended into the cellar, bringing blankets, water, ration boxes, and more medical supplies. They began to help the civilians out of the darkness, supporting the elderly, carrying the weak, speaking in reassuring tones even when their German failed and they had to rely on gestures and expressions alone. Herr Volkmann, the old school teacher, climbed out into the winter daylight and stood blinking in the weak January sun. He had not seen daylight in 7 weeks. He had expected to die in that cellar. Now he stood in the ruins of his city, wrapped in an American Army blanket, holding a tin cup of hot coffee that an American private had pressed into his trembling hands, and he began to understand that everything he had been taught about the enemy had been a lie. The medical treatment Anneliese received over the following days would be documented in the records of the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. The division's medical teams had established aid stations throughout occupied Aachen, treating both American casualties and German civilians. This was not official policy in the early days of the occupation, but many American medics, trained to preserve life and bound by the oath of their profession, could not turn away from suffering when they encountered it, regardless of which side of the conflict the sufferer had been on. Anneliese was suffering from pneumonia, severe malnutrition, and dehydration. By all reasonable medical assessments, she should have died in that cellar. That she did not was due to several factors: the swift intervention of Cohen and Martinez, the availability of antibiotics, specifically sulfur drugs, and, in some cases, the newly distributed penicillin, and the establishment of proper medical facilities where she could receive ongoing care. She was evacuated to a civilian hospital in the American WWII area, where German doctors and nurses, now working under American supervision, could continue her treatment. The food that sustained her recovery came from American military rations and Red Cross supplies. The medicine came from American pharmaceutical companies, the logistics that delivered it from American trucks burning American gasoline. Even the coal that heated the hospital had been requisitioned from American supply depots. The sheer abundance of it staggered the German medical staff, who had spent years working with ever-dwindling resources, stretching supplies that could not be stretched, watching patients die for want of medicines that the German war economy could no longer provide. Dr. Friedrich Hartmann, who treated Anneliese during her hospital stay, recorded his impressions in a diary that would later be preserved in the collection of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He wrote, "The Americans arrived with such plenty that at first we thought it must be for show, a temporary abundance meant to impress us before the real deprivation began. We had lived so long with scarcity that we could not imagine it was real. But it is real. They waste more in a day than we have seen in months. They throw away food that we would have treasured. Their soldiers carry chocolate bars in their pockets and give them to children on the street. Where does it come from? this endless supply. We were told the Americans were weak, decadent, that their economy was controlled by Jewish financiers bleeding the nation dry. But a nation bled dry does not feed its enemies' children. A weak nation does not cross an ocean with such force. We were lied to. God forgive us. We were lied to about everything. Margaret Schroeder did not leave her daughter's bedside for the first 48 hours after Anneliese was admitted to the hospital. She sat in a wooden chair, still wearing the same filthy clothes she had worn in the cellar, and watched her child breathe. American nurses brought her food: white bread with butter, soup with actual meat in it, coffee with real sugar, and she ate mechanically, unable to process the sudden transition from starvation to plenty. One of the nurses, a young woman from Iowa named Dorothy Brennan, sat with Margaret during the night shifts and tried to communicate despite the language barrier. Years later, in an oral history recorded for the Veterans History Project of the Library of Congress, Brennan would recall, she couldn't understand why we were helping her. She kept asking, through gestures and the few words we could share, why we didn't just let the child die. She seemed to think that was what she deserved, that her daughter deserved to die because of what Germany had done. It broke my heart. I tried to explain that we weren't there for revenge. We were there to help people. But I don't think she could believe it. She'd been through too much. She just sat there crying and watching her little girl breathe, like she was afraid that if she looked away, it would all turn out to be a dream. The psychological impact of this experience on the German civilians who witnessed it cannot be overstated. For years, they had been indoctrinated with a worldview that divided humanity into rigid hierarchies of worth. They had been taught that Germans were the master race destined to rule, and that others, Jews, Slavs, Africans, were subhuman. The Americans, in this schema, were mongrels, racially mixed and therefore degenerate, controlled by Jewish interests and incapable of true civilization. This ideology had been reinforced through every channel of German society: schools, newspapers, radio, film, even church sermons in many cases. It was the air they breathed. And then the Americans arrived, and the ideology shattered against the reality of experience. The Americans were not the monsters they had been promised. The American soldiers who pulled them from the cellars were not savage rapists and murderers. They were young men, some of them barely 20 years old, who shared their rations and their cigarettes, who helped old women up staircases and carried children on their shoulders. They were black soldiers and white soldiers, Jewish soldiers and Christian soldiers, men from every corner of that vast, incomprehensible nation across the ocean, and they worked together with an easy camaraderie that itself contradicted everything the Germans had been taught about racial purity and hierarchy. One German woman, interviewed decades later for a documentary on the American occupation, remembered, "We had been told the Americans would be brutal. But they were kind. Not all of them. Not always. There were incidents, crimes, the kind of things that happen when young men are far from home and the normal rules break down. But as a whole, they were kind. And that kindness was more devastating than any punishment could have been, because it meant we had to confront what we had done, what we had supported. If they had been monsters, we could have told ourselves that everyone was the same, that this was just how nations behaved in war. But they weren't monsters. They were better than us, and we had to live with that." In the hospital where Anneliese recovered, a small community formed among the German civilians who were being treated there. They shared their stories in whispers, comparing experiences, trying to reconcile what they had been told with what they were seeing. Herr Volkmann, the school teacher, found himself at the center of many of these conversations. Before the war, he had been a member of the Nazi Party, not an enthusiastic member, he would later insist, but a member nonetheless. It had been necessary for his position. He had taught the party's version of history to his students. He had led them in songs praising the Führer. He had believed, or told himself he believed, that the hardships were temporary, that the promised glory was still coming. Now he sat in a hospital corridor, wrapped in an American blanket, drinking American coffee, and tried to understand how his world had inverted so completely. He began to speak with the American soldiers who guarded the hospital, practicing his English, asking careful questions. One of them, a sergeant from New York named James Goldberg, spent an evening explaining the American system of government to him: the elections, the separation of powers, the Bill of Rights. Volkman listened with the intensity of a man who has discovered that everything he thought he knew was false and is desperate for some new framework to make sense of existence. "But how do you maintain order?" Volkman asked in his careful English. "If the people choose their leaders, and the leaders can be removed, how do you prevent chaos?" Goldberg had laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine amusement at the question. "We don't prevent chaos, exactly. We control it. We channel it. The chaos is built into the system. People argue. They disagree. They fight with words and laws instead of bullets. It's messy, but it works. It works because everyone agrees to follow the rules, even when they lose. And if someone doesn't agree, if someone refuses to follow the rules, then we have courts. We have laws. We have ways of handling it that don't require tearing the whole thing down and starting over with a dictator." Volkman had nodded slowly, turning this over in his mind. It seemed almost fantastical to him. A government that drew its power from the consent of the governed, that could be criticized and challenged without the critic being arrested, that could change leaders without violence or terror. He had been taught that such systems were weak, that they led inevitably to Jewish domination or communist revolution. But here was Sergeant Goldberg, who was Jewish, wore his Star of David openly, in fact, explaining how his family had come from Russia 2 generations ago, how they had built a life in America, how his brother was a doctor and his sister a teacher. And Goldberg carried a rifle and wore the uniform of the most powerful military force on Earth. The contradictions were overwhelming. Volkman spent long nights staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what he had believed with what he now knew. Many Germans went through similar crises of understanding in those early months of the occupation. Some retreated into denial, insisting that the Americans were only being kind because they had won, that this generosity was temporary and would give way to the expected brutality once the occupation was secure. But for others, like Volkman, denial became impossible. The evidence was too immediate, too personal, too consistent. As Anneliese grew stronger, as color returned to her cheeks and she began to eat solid food and even to play with a small stuffed rabbit that one of the American nurses had given her, Margaret began to emerge from her own fog of shock and grief. She started to notice details. She noticed that the hospital was scrupulously clean, that the American doctors washed their hands constantly, that they had more medicine than they needed and shared it freely. She noticed that the American soldiers guarding the hospital were friendly with the German staff, that they joked and traded English lessons for German lessons, that they showed photographs of their own families back home. She noticed, too, the food. The endless, impossible abundance of food. The American mess hall fed both American personnel and German civilians working at the hospital, and the quantities served shocked her. She had not seen this much food in years. There was meat at almost every meal, real meat, not the sawdust extended sausages or ersatz products that had become standard in Germany. There was white bread made from actual wheat, not the dark, heavy bread mixed with chestnuts and whatever else could be ground into flour. There was butter. There was sugar. There was coffee that tasted like coffee, not roasted barley or chicory. One evening, as she ate dinner in the hospital cafeteria with other German civilians, she began to cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of eating a meal that would have been unthinkable a month ago while her daughter lay upstairs recovering from near starvation under the care of the enemy. An elderly man at the table, a former baker named Otto Richter, reached across and patted her hand. "I know," he said quietly. "I know. They are feeding us," Margaret whispered. "Why are they feeding us?" Richter had no answer to that. None of them did. The Americans' behavior violated every prediction, every ideological framework they had been given. If the war had been about racial superiority, why were the Americans treating their racial inferiors with such care? If it had been about Jewish conspiracy to destroy Germany, why were Jewish American soldiers helping rebuild German hospitals and feeding German children? If the Americans were the decadent, weak enemy that propaganda had portrayed, How had they crossed an ocean and defeated the Wehrmacht while simultaneously producing enough surplus food to feed millions of conquered civilians? The answers to these questions, when they began to emerge, were profoundly disturbing to people who had built their identities around Nazi ideology. The answers suggested that everything, the racial theories, the conspiracy narratives, the promises of destiny and glory, had been lies. Not mistakes or miscalculations, but deliberate lies told by leaders who had led them into catastrophe. On January 30th, 1945, 13 days after American medics had pulled Annalise from the edge of death, Margaret was sitting beside her daughter's bed when a new American officer arrived to inspect the hospital facilities. He was older than most of the soldiers, perhaps in his late 30s, with the bearing of a professional rather than a conscript. His nameplate identified him as Major David Eisenberg, and he spoke fluent German with a slight accent that Margaret could not place. Eisenberg stopped at Annalise's bed and spoke briefly with the attending nurse, reviewing the child's chart. Then he turned to Margaret and introduced himself. "Your daughter is doing very well," he said in his careful German. "The doctors expect a full recovery." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Eisenberg studied her for a moment, then pulled up a chair and sat down beside her. "May I ask you something?" he said. She nodded again. "What were you told about us? About the Americans?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that Margaret answered without thinking, "That you would kill us. That you hated us. That you would destroy everything." Eisenberg nodded slowly. "And now? Now I don't understand anything." The major was silent for a moment, considering his words. Then he said, "My grandparents came from Germany, from Bavaria. They left in 1887 and went to America because they were poor and hungry, and they had heard that in America, anyone could build a life. My grandfather worked in a steel mill in Pittsburgh. My father became a lawyer. I went to university, became a doctor. That's what America gave my family, the chance to become whatever we were capable of becoming." He gestured around the hospital ward. "This isn't about charity. This is about values. We believe that every person has worth, that children deserve to live regardless of what their parents' government did. We believe in systems that give people choices instead of orders. And yes, we believe in abundance, not because we're wasteful, but because we've built a society that produces enough for everyone. That's not weakness. That's strength." Margaret looked at him with something like wonder. "But we tried to destroy you." "Yes," Eisenberg said simply. "You did. Your government did. And now you have to live with that. And we have to decide what kind of victors we're going to be. We could be cruel. God knows there are people in America who think we should be. But cruelty doesn't rebuild civilization. It doesn't create lasting peace. So we're choosing something else." He stood up, preparing to continue his rounds. But before he left, he said one more thing. "Your daughter will grow up in a different Germany than the one you knew. Make sure she understands why." The symbolic weight of food in the American occupation of Germany cannot be overstated. For years, Germans had been told that their hardships were necessary sacrifices for the greater good, that the war economy required them to tighten their belts, that victory would bring abundance. Instead, defeat brought abundance, delivered by the very enemy they had been told would starve them. This inversion was not lost on the German population. American soldiers carried rations that seemed impossibly luxurious to Germans who had been living on turnips and ersatz bread. The K-ration, standard issue for American troops, contained not just calories but variety: canned meat, crackers, coffee, sugar, chocolate, cigarettes. A single K-ration provided better nutrition than most German civilians had access to in a week. And the Americans had so many of these rations that they could afford to give them away to hungry children on the street. The C-ration was even more elaborate: canned meals with meat and vegetables, fruit, cookies or candy, coffee, sugar, and chewing gum. German children who had never tasted chewing gum became obsessed with it. The strange, sweet, pointless luxury of it seemed to encapsulate everything about American excess and plenty. And the soldiers handed it out freely, along with chocolate bars, often to the same children whose fathers had been shooting at them weeks or days before. This behavior baffled German adults. who had been trained to think in terms of hierarchy and worthiness. Why give food to the enemy's children? Why waste resources on those who had not earned them? But the American soldiers, products of a different ideological system, saw hungry children and shared their surplus. To them, it was simply the human thing to do. To the Germans, it was a revolutionary act that undermined years of propaganda about survival of the fittest and racial competition for resources. Anneliese Schroeder, recovering in her hospital bed, received her first taste of American chocolate on February 3, 1945. A young private from Georgia, whose own daughter was about Anneliese's age, had brought it to her on his own initiative. Margaret watched her daughter's face light up with wonder at the sweetness, watched her smile for the first time in months, and understood in that moment that the world had fundamentally changed. The chocolate bar, a Hershey bar, standard issue, worth perhaps 10 cents in America, had accomplished what all the propaganda, all the ideology, all the promises of the Nazi regime could not. It had given her daughter a reason to hope. The transformation in German attitudes during the early months of the occupation was not universal or immediate. Many Germans remained bitter, resentful, convinced that they had been betrayed from within rather than defeated honestly. The myth of the stab in the back that had plagued Germany after World War I began to resurface. The idea that the German military had been unbeatable, that only traitors and weaklings had caused the collapse. Some clung to the hope that the Americans and Soviets would turn on each other, that the Reich might yet be restored. But for those who had direct, personal experience with the occupation, particularly those who had been helped, who had been shown kindness when they expected cruelty, the ideological grip began to loosen. The evidence was simply too overwhelming. Herr Volkmann, the former school teacher, began to compile notes toward what he hoped might someday be a book about the failure of Nazi education. He interviewed other Germans in the hospital, collecting their stories, trying to understand how an entire nation had been led so far astray. "We were not stupid people," he wrote in his journal. "We were educated, cultured, heirs to Goethe and Beethoven and Kant. And yet we fell for the most transparent lies. We embraced the most obvious evil, because it was wrapped in the flag and presented as patriotism. We wanted to believe we were special, that our suffering had meaning, that our sacrifices would lead to greatness. And men who understood that hunger for meaning exploited it brilliantly. They gave us scapegoats and enemies and a story about destiny. And we believed, God help us, we believed." But Volkmann also noted something else in his observations of the American soldiers. They too had a story about destiny, about their nation's special role in the world. They too believed they were defending something exceptional, something worth fighting for. The difference, and it was a crucial difference, was that their story was not built on hatred and exclusion. The American story, as imperfectly as it was practiced, was about inclusion, about the possibility that anyone, from anywhere, could become American, about government deriving its power from the consent of the governed, about the dignity and worth of individual human life. They believe they are exceptional, Volkmann wrote, but their exceptionalism includes the possibility that others can join them. Ours require that others be destroyed. That is the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship, between a nation built on principles and one built on blood. The Americans fight for ideas. We fought for a man, a party, a myth. And when the man died, when the party collapsed, when the myth was revealed as a lie, we had nothing left but ruins and shame. But their ideas survived defeat and victory alike, because ideas cannot be killed with bullets. By late February, Anneliese was well enough to be discharged from the hospital. The American authorities had established a displaced persons system to help German civilians find housing in the ruins of their cities. Margaret and her daughter were assigned to a partially intact apartment building on the west side of Aachen, where they would share space with 2 other families. The building had no heat beyond what could be provided by a small stove, and water had to be carried from a pump 3 blocks away, but it had walls and a roof and windows that could be covered with boards. After the cellar, it seemed like a palace. On the day they left the hospital, Nurse Dorothy Brennan gave Margaret a care package, extra blankets, some canned food, a bar of soap, and a small stuffed rabbit for Anneliese, a companion to the one the child had been given in the hospital. Margaret tried to thank her, but found she had no words adequate to the situation. How do you thank someone for giving you back your daughter's life? How do you bridge the gulf between enemy and savior? Brennan hugged her, and Margaret found herself weeping again, as she had wept so many times in recent weeks. But these tears were different. They were not tears of despair or grief or incomprehension. They were tears of gratitude and relief, and the beginning of something that might eventually become healing. As they left the hospital, Margaret passed Major Eisenberg in the corridor. He smiled at Annalise and said something in English that Margaret didn't understand. The child, who had been learning English words from the nurses, responded with a careful, heavily accented thank you. Eisenberg laughed, delighted, and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a Hershey bar and handed it to the girl, who accepted it with wide eyes and clutched it to her chest like treasure. Then he looked at Margaret and said in German, "Remember what I told you. Make sure she understands." Margaret nodded. "I will." In the years that followed, the story of what happened in that cellar on Wilhelmstrasse would become part of Margaret Schroeder's family history, passed down through generations. Annalise would grow up in the new Federal Republic of Germany, a nation rebuilt with American aid through the Marshall Plan, a nation that chose democracy and integration with the West over neutrality or alignment with the Soviet East. She would attend university, become a teacher like Herr Volkmann had been, and spend her career educating German children about the importance of democratic values and the dangers of authoritarian seduction. She would tell her own students about the day American medics saved her life in a cellar in Aachen, about the abundance and kindness that had contradicted everything her mother had been taught to expect. And she would tell them that freedom was not weakness, that diversity was not degeneration, that a government answerable to its people was not chaos but the foundation of lasting civilization. The chocolate bar that Private James Murphy from Georgia had given her in the hospital became, in her memory, a symbol of everything that had changed. It represented not just American abundance but American generosity, not just material surplus but a worldview that valued human life, all human life, even the lives of enemy children, over ideology. That chocolate bar, worth a few cents, had been worth more than all the promises of the Third Reich, because it was real, and it was given freely, and it came with no demand for loyalty or obedience in return. Herr Volkmann did eventually write his book. Published in 1952, The Education of Era became a significant text in the denazification literature that helped post-war Germany confront its past. In it, he detailed how the educational system had been corrupted, how teachers had been pressured or persuaded to indoctrinate rather than educate, how the mechanisms of totalitarian control had worked their way into every classroom in Germany. But he also wrote about the occupation, about the Americans who had shown him that another way was possible. They defeated us, he wrote in the book's conclusion, and then they taught us, not through lectures or punishment, but through example. They showed us what a free society looked like in practice, messy, argumentative, inefficient in some ways, but ultimately more powerful and more humane than anything we had built. They fed us when we were hungry, healed us when we were sick, and gave us the opportunity to rebuild not just our cities but our values. We had been taught that mercy was weakness. They taught us that mercy could be the foundation of strength. The medical records of the 16th Infantry Regiment show that between October 1944 and March 1945, American medics in and around Aachen treated over 12,000 German civilians for various ailments, injuries, and conditions. Hundreds of those treatments were for children suffering from malnutrition, exposure, and disease, conditions that would have been fatal without intervention. The survival rate for civilians treated by American medical personnel was remarkably high, a testament both to the skill of the medics and to the availability of resources. Those resources came from a nation that had not been bombed, a homeland whose factories had been running at full capacity for years, whose farms produced such surplus that food could be shipped across an ocean and distributed not just to soldiers but to conquered civilians. The sheer logistical achievement of the American war effort, the ability to project power across the Atlantic, to supply millions of troops in the field, and still have enough left over to feed the enemy's children, was something that the German General Staff had not believed possible. They had calculated that American industrial power, while impressive, could not be effectively translated into military force. They had believed that democracy was inherently inefficient, that a dictatorial system could mobilize resources more effectively. They had been catastrophically wrong. The American system, for all its arguments and inefficiencies and political squabbles, had proven capable of organizing the most effective military machine in human history while simultaneously maintaining a civilian economy that produced unprecedented abundance. This was a lesson written in canned rations and Hershey bars and sulfur drugs. Not that Americans were inherently superior to Germans, but that the system mattered, that the choice between tyranny and freedom had practical consequences that extended far beyond abstract philosophy. A free people, it turned out, were more productive, more innovative, more resilient than a regimented population living under constant surveillance and terror. Given the choice between the two models, the evidence was overwhelming. Margaret Schroeder lived until 1992, long enough to see the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany. In her final years, as Germany wrestled with the legacy of both its Nazi past and its communist experiment in the East, she gave several interviews to historians researching the immediate post-war period. In one of these interviews, conducted in 1989, she was asked what she remembered most vividly from those dark months in Aachen. "The crying," she said. "I remember the crying. We had cried so much, for our dead, for our city, for everything we had lost. We had cried in fear and in despair. But the moment I remember most clearly is when that American medic said my daughter was alive, and I began to cry with something else. Relief, yes. Gratitude, yes. But also shame. Terrible, overwhelming shame. Because in that moment I understood that we had been wrong about everything. And those tears, the tears of German women watching American soldiers save a German child, those were the tears that began to wash away the lies we had believed." She paused, looking out the window of her apartment, which faced the rebuilt Cathedral of Aachen. People talk about denazification as if it were a program, a policy, something imposed from outside. But the real denazification happened in moments like that one in the cellar, when reality crashed against ideology and ideology shattered. When we had to choose between clinging to comfortable lies or accepting difficult truths. Not everyone made that choice. Some people never did. But for those of us who saw it, who experienced the kindness when we expected cruelty, the abundance when we expected starvation, for us, there was no going back. The interviewer asked her if she had ever tried to find the medics who saved her daughter. Margaret shook her head. "I didn't know their names. Not really. I knew what their tags said, Cohen and Martinez, but I didn't know where they came from, how to find them. After the war, I was just trying to survive, to rebuild a life. And then years passed, and it seemed impossible. But I thought about them often. I prayed for them, even though I wasn't sure I believed in prayer anymore. I wanted them to know what they had done, not just for my daughter but for all of us in that cellar. They showed us that the enemy could be more human than our own leaders had been. That lesson, that gift, I carried it with me every day of my life." The small stuffed rabbit that Nose Brennan had given to Anneliese was preserved as a family heirloom. When Anneliese had children of her own, she showed them the worn toy and told them its story. When those children had children, they heard the story too. By the time the family donated it to the Aachen Museum in 2003, the rabbit had become a symbol that extended far beyond one family's experience. It represented something essential about that historical moment. The collision of two value systems, one based on hierarchy and domination, the other on equality and consent. The Nazi system had promised strength through purity, greatness through conquest, security through the elimination of threats. The American system promised opportunity through freedom, prosperity through productivity, security through law. In the ruins of Aachen in early 1945, those two systems met, and the contrast could not have been more stark. The Germans had built an ideology that required constant enemies, constant struggle, constant sacrifice in service to an abstracted greatness that always seemed to be one more victory away. The Americans, for all their flaws and contradictions, had built a system that produced such abundance that soldiers could give away chocolate bars and canned meat to children whose fathers had been trying to kill them weeks before. That abundance was not magic. It was the product of a society that rewarded innovation, that protected property rights, that allowed people to pursue their own interests within a framework of law, that derived its legitimacy from the consent of the governed rather than the dictates of a leader. The stuffed rabbit, sitting in its climate-controlled case in the museum, is not a symbol of American perfection. America in 1945 was still a nation where black soldiers fought in segregated units, where Japanese Americans had been interned in camps, where women were excluded from many spheres of power and influence. But it was also a nation capable of self-correction, of progress, of extending the circle of its principles even when those principles were imperfectly applied. It was a nation that could criticize its own government without fear, that could change its leaders without violence, that could debate its values and sometimes, slowly, change them. That difference between a system that could evolve and one that could only double down on its errors until it collapsed was what those German civilians in Aachen were beginning to understand as they accepted American food and American medicine and began to rebuild their lives. The epilogue to this story extends across decades, across generations, woven into the fabric of modern Germany. The children who survived that winter went on to build a different nation, one that learned, painfully and incompletely, the lessons of its catastrophic era. They built a democracy, flawed but functional. They built an economy that became the engine of Europe. They built a culture that insisted on remembering its darkest moments rather than burying them. And they built these things with the help of the nation they had tried to destroy. The Marshall Plan poured billions of dollars into European recovery, rebuilding not just infrastructure but institutions, supporting not just factories but the foundations of civil society. It was an act of strategic self-interest, certainly. A prosperous, democratic Europe would be a bulwark against Soviet expansion. But it was also an act of generosity unprecedented in human history. Never before had a conquering power invested so heavily in rebuilding the nations it had defeated. The wisdom of that investment has been proven many times over. The Germany that emerged from the ruins, the Germany that Anneliese Schroeder helped to build through her work as an educator, became one of America's closest allies, a pillar of NATO, a champion of human rights and democratic values. The cycle of violence and vengeance that had plagued Europe for centuries was broken, not by further conquest, but by the choice to rebuild rather than punish, to include rather than exclude, to teach rather than dominate. This was a larger truth that Major Eisenberg had been trying to convey in that hospital corridor, that the choice of what kind of victor to be was as important as the fact of victory itself. That cruelty breeds cruelty, but mercy can plant the seeds of lasting peace. That the values you fight for must be reflected in how you treat those you defeat, or those values become hollow. The medics who descended into that cellar on Wilhelmstrasse in January 1945 were not thinking in these grand terms. They were not philosophers or statesmen. They were tired young men doing their jobs, following their training, acting on the simple human impulse to help someone in need. But their actions, multiplied across thousands of similar moments, across millions of interactions between American soldiers and German civilians, built the foundation for a transformation more profound than any military victory could achieve alone. They demonstrated, in the most practical and immediate terms, what freedom meant. Not freedom as an abstract principle, but freedom as it manifested in daily life. Abundance instead of scarcity, choice instead of compulsion, mercy instead of merciless doctrine. And that demonstration, repeated in countless variations across occupied Germany, accomplished what all the propaganda and re-education programs could not. It changed minds not through argument, but through experience. Today, in the rebuilt city of Aachen, there's a small plaque on Wilhelmstrasse, near where that cellar once stood. The building is gone, torn down in the reconstruction, replaced by modern apartments. But the city remembered the story, and in 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, they installed the memorial. It reads, in German and English, "In this place, in January 1945, American medics of the 1st Infantry Division saved the life of a German child. Their act of mercy, and thousands like it, helped to heal not just bodies but a nation. May we never forget what we learned in those dark days. That humanity transcends ideology, that kindness is stronger than hate, and that the path to lasting peace is built not on vengeance but on the courage to show mercy to those who once were enemies. Every year, on the anniversary of Aachen's liberation, a small ceremony takes place there. German and American officials lay wreaths. School children learn the story. Veterans, the few who remain, share their memories. And the city remembers that its rebirth began not with grand political decisions or economic plans, but with two tired medics descending into a dark cellar to fight for the life of a dying child. That child, Anneliese Schroeder-Hoffmann, attended the dedication of the plaque in 1995. She was 54 years old then, a respected educator, a mother and grandmother. She spoke briefly to the assembled crowd, her voice steady despite her emotion. "I do not remember being saved," she said. "I was too young, too sick. My first clear memory is waking up in the hospital, warm and clean, with my mother crying beside me. But I have lived my entire life in the shadow of that moment. Everything I am, everything I have been able to become, exists because two young American men chose to see a human life worth saving rather than an enemy worth ignoring. That choice ripples forward through time. My children, my grandchildren, the thousands of students I have taught, all of them exist in the wake of that moment of mercy. I have tried to honor it by teaching others what I learned from it, that we always have a choice between cruelty and kindness, between the closed fist and the open hand. And the choice we make defines not just ourselves, but the world we create for those who come after. The chocolate bar has melted, the rations consumed, the medical supplies long since expended. But the choice those medics made, the choice that America made in how it treated its defeated enemies, still resonates. It resonates in the alliance between nations that were once at war, in the prosperity of a Europe rebuilt from ruins, in the democratic institutions that replaced dictatorships, in the generations of children who grew up free because someone chose mercy over vengeance. This is the legacy written in that cellar, in that hospital, in the tears of German women watching American soldiers save a German child. That the arc of history bends toward justice only when we bend it. That the choice between tyranny and freedom matters not just philosophically but practically, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not a weapon at all, but a Hershey bar, freely given, to a child who had been taught to fear the hand that offered it. The war was won on battlefields, but the peace was won in moments like these. Small mercies multiplied across a continent, building trust where there had been only hate, planting hope in soil poisoned by ideology. And from that poisoned soil, somehow, impossibly, grew a new Europe, a better Germany, a world that had learned, at terrible cost, that the greatest strength is not the will to dominate but the wisdom to heal. This is what Anneliese carried with her all her days. The knowledge that she had been saved by the very people she was taught to fear, and that in that saving, she had been given not just life but a lesson about what life could be. In the end, that lesson proved more powerful than any army, more enduring than any conquest, more revolutionary than any ideology. It was simply this, that we are all human, that suffering deserves compassion regardless of flags or uniforms, and that the measure of a civilization is not in how it treats its friends but in how it treats its enemies when it has the power to do anything it wishes. The medics who saved Anneliese probably never knew the ripples their actions would create. They moved on to the next crisis, the next casualty, the next town that needed liberating or healing. But in that cellar, in that moment, they did more than save one child. They proved that another way was possible. And in proving it, they helped to build a peace that has lasted, imperfectly but persistently, for 3/4 of a century and counting. That is the power of mercy. That is the strength of freedom. That is the gift that two exhausted young medics gave to a dying child and, through her, to the world.